The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the frozen Texas plains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of amber and rose. Jake Morrison pulled his worn cavalry coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter December air. From his position on the ridge overlooking the Comanche village, he could see the peaceful scene below. Skin lodges arranged in careful circles, thin wisps of smoke rising from dying fires, and the occasional movement of an early riser preparing for the day ahead. "Beautiful morning for it, ain't it, Morrison?" Colonel Hartwell's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The commanding officer sat rigid in his saddle, his weathered face set in grim determination. "Today we finish what should have been done years ago." Jake said nothing, his pale blue eyes fixed on the village below. At 32, he'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from an Apache raid that had claimed his wife and son 5 years earlier, seemed to throb in the cold air. He'd signed on as a scout for the cavalry, not out of hatred, but out of a need to stay moving, to outrun the ghosts that haunted his dreams. "You hear me, Morrison?" Hartwell's tone sharpened. "I said it's a beautiful morning for justice." "Yes, sir," Jake replied quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I heard you." The colonel studied him with suspicious eyes. Hartwell was a career soldier, 20 years of Indian fighting having carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He'd lost his own brother in a Comanche raid near San Antonio, and that loss had turned him into something harder than the winter ground beneath their horses' hooves. "Remember, men," Hartwell addressed the 40 soldiers spread out along the ridge, "we're here to recover stolen cattle and punish those responsible for the attacks on the Murphy Ranch. Any who resist will be dealt with accordingly." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He'd been to the Murphy Ranch the week before. The cattle had been driven off, true enough, but the attacks Hartwell spoke of had been little more than the theft of some chickens and grain, hardly worth the lives that would be lost in the next hour. As if reading his thoughts, Sergeant Mills guided his horse closer to Jake's position. The grizzled veteran had served under Hartwell for 8 years, and his loyalty was absolute. "You got that look again, Morrison," Mills muttered. "Best remember which side you're on." "I remember," Jake said, though his voice carried no conviction. The signal came at exactly 6 o'clock. Hartwell raised his gloved hand, held it for a moment against the lightening sky, then brought it down in a sharp cutting motion. The cavalry swept down the ridge like a winter avalanche, their horses' hooves thundering against the frozen earth. Jake rode with them, but something in his chest had turned to ice. As they crashed into the village, he watched the peaceful morning transform into chaos. Lodge flaps flew open, as startled families emerged, children crying, women screaming, men reaching for weapons that weren't there. Most of the warriors were away on a winter hunt, leaving behind only the old, the young, and the helpless. The slaughter was swift and brutal. Jake found himself at the edge of the village, unable to participate in the massacre unfolding around him. He dismounted and moved through the confusion on foot, his rifle held low, trying to avoid the worst of the violence. "Please," an elderly Comanche woman reached toward him, her weathered hands trembling. "Please, the children." Before Jake could respond, a shot rang out behind him. The woman crumpled to the snow, her blood spreading like spilled ink across the white ground. Jake spun around to see Sergeant Mills lowering his smoking rifle. "What are you doing, Morrison?" Mills shouted over the chaos. "This is war, not a tea party." Jake stared at the dead woman, then at Mills, his hands tightening on his weapon. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the blood-soaked snow, and Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him, a breaking point he'd been approaching for years. "Mount up!" Hartwell's voice boomed across the village. "We're moving out!" As quickly as it had begun, the attack was over. The cavalry had rounded up a dozen survivors, mostly women and children who would be taken to the reservation. Several lodges had been set ablaze, their flames reaching toward the gray morning sky like desperate prayers. Jake climbed back onto his horse, his movements mechanical and numb. As the cavalry formation began to move away from the devastation, he heard it, a sound that cut through the winter air like a knife through his soul. The desperate, keening cry of an infant, somewhere in the burning village behind them. He reined in his horse and turned in his saddle, listening. The cry came again, weaker now, but unmistakably real. A baby, alone and abandoned in the ruins of its world. "Morrison!" Hartwell's voice cracked like a whip. "Fall in line!" Jake looked at his commanding officer, then back at the smoking village. The baby's cries were growing fainter, nearly lost in the wind. Around him, the other soldiers rode on, their faces set forward, refusing to acknowledge what they'd left behind. "I said fall in line, Scout." Jake Morrison had followed orders his entire adult life. He'd buried his wife and son, then buried his grief in duty and distance. But something in that infant's cry reached past all his defenses, past all his carefully constructed walls. Without a word, he wheeled his horse around and began riding back toward the burning village. "Morrison!" Hartwell's shout followed him. "You ride back there, you're on your own, you hear me? You're on your own!" The baby's cries grew louder as Jake approached the ruins, and for the first time in 5 years, he knew exactly where he needed to be. The acrid smell of burning buffalo hide filled Jake's nostrils as he rode through the smoldering remains of the Comanche village. His horse, a sturdy bay named Ranger, stepped carefully around bodies and debris, the animal's ears flicking nervously at the unfamiliar sounds and scents of destruction. The baby's cries had grown weaker, more intermittent, and Jake felt a growing urgency as he searched through the chaos. Behind him, the cavalry had disappeared over the ridge, leaving only the distant sound of hoofbeats and Hartwell's final shouted threat echoing in the cold morning air. Jake knew there would be no going back now. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that would brand him as a deserter, or worse. The infant's cry came again, thin and desperate, from somewhere near the center of the village. Jake dismounted and moved on foot, his boots crunching through the blood-stained snow. The scene around him was devastating. Overturned cooking pots, scattered belongings, and the lifeless forms of people who had been preparing for just another winter day when death came calling. He found the baby beneath the collapsed remains of a lodge, protected by the body of a young Comanche woman who had died shielding the child with her own flesh. The woman's dark hair was spread across the snow like a raven's wing, and her lifeless eyes stared up at the grey sky. She couldn't have been more than 20, with the kind of beauty that transcended race or circumstance. "Jesus!" Jake whispered, dropping to his knees beside them. The baby, a girl he realized, was wrapped in a soft deerskin blanket decorated with intricate beadwork. She was perhaps 6 months old, with jet-black hair and dark eyes that seemed far too wise for such a small face. Her cries had weakened to pitiful whimpers, and Jake could see she was nearly frozen, her tiny lips blue with cold. Gently, reverently, Jake lifted the child from her mother's protective embrace. The woman's arms were stiff with death and cold, and he had to carefully work the baby free. As he did, he noticed something that made his blood run cold, a cavalry saber wound in the woman's back, still seeping crimson into the snow. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the dead woman, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'm so damn sorry." The baby stirred in his arms, her tiny fist grasping at the air. Jake looked down at her, this small survivor of unspeakable tragedy, and felt something crack open inside his chest, a place that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried his own family. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. As if in answer, the baby opened her eyes and looked directly at him. There was no fear there, only trust, the kind of absolute faith that only the very young could possess. Jake felt tears he hadn't shed in years threatening to spill over. A sound behind him made him spin around, his hand moving instinctively to his Colt .45. 3 Comanche warriors stood at the edge of the village, their faces painted for war, their weapons drawn. They must have returned from the hunt to find their world destroyed, their families slaughtered. The leader, a man in his 30s with ceremonial scars marking his cheeks, stepped forward. His dark eyes moved from Jake to the baby in his arms, then to the body of the young woman. Jake saw the moment recognition hit, the warrior's face contorted with grief and rage. "Nadua," the warrior said, his voice breaking. "My daughter." Jake's heart sank. He was holding this man's grandchild, standing over the body of his daughter, wearing the uniform of the men who had killed her. "I didn't," Jake began, but the warrior cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You did not kill her," the man said in careful English, "but you wear their colors. You ride with the murderers." "I came back," Jake said quietly. "I came back for the baby." The warrior's companions flanked him, their faces hard as stone. Jake knew he was moments away from death, but something made him stand his ground. Maybe it was the weight of the child in his arms, or maybe it was the knowledge that he deserved whatever justice these men might deliver. "You came back," the warrior repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Why?" Jake looked down at the baby, then back at the man who was clearly her grandfather. Because she was crying, because she was alone, because... He paused, searching for words that could bridge the vast chasm between them. Because it was the right thing to do. The warrior studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. "I am Standing Bear," he said. "This was my daughter, Nadwa. The child is called Ayana, Eternal Bloom." "Jake Morrison," Jake replied, shifting the baby to one arm so he could extend his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Standing Bear took it. "You cannot take her to your people," Standing Bear said, his voice heavy with grief. "They will put her in the white man's schools, teach her to hate what she is." "I won't let that happen," Jake said, though he had no idea how he could prevent it. Standing Bear's eyes narrowed. "You make big promises, Bluecoat. How do I know you speak truth?" Before Jake could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the plains. Standing Bear and his companions immediately raised their weapons, and Jake felt his stomach drop. Through the morning mist, he could see a cavalry patrol approaching, not Hartwell's main force, but a smaller group, probably sent back to look for him. "They come for you," Standing Bear said grimly. Jake looked at the baby in his arms, then at the warriors surrounding him. In that moment, he made another choice that would change everything. He pulled off his cavalry coat and threw it in the snow, then began unbuttoning his military shirt. "I'm not going back with them," he said firmly. "I'm done being a soldier." Standing Bear's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You would abandon your own people." "My people don't murder women and children," Jake replied, his voice hard as winter iron. "At least they shouldn't." The hoofbeats were getting closer. Standing Bear made a quick decision. "There is a place," he said urgently. "Her Canyon, 3 days' ride north, many caves. You can hide there until the soldiers stop looking." "Why would you help me?" Jake asked. Standing Bear looked at his dead daughter, then at the baby in Jake's arms. "Because my granddaughter chooses you," he said simply, "and because a man who throws away his uniform for a child's life might be worth saving." The cavalry patrol was almost upon them. Standing Bear and his warriors melted into the ruins of the village like smoke, leaving Jake alone with the baby and a terrible choice to make. Jake's mind raced as the cavalry patrol drew closer. He could hear Sergeant Mill's gruff voice barking orders, the jingle of spurs and bridles, the steady rhythm of hooves on frozen ground. Little Ayana had gone quiet in his arms, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Without his military coat, Jake felt the brutal December cold cutting through his cotton shirt, but there was no time to worry about comfort. He quickly gathered what he could from the ruins around him, a water pouch, some dried meat wrapped in hide, and a thick buffalo robe that would keep both him and the baby warm. "Morrison," Mills's voice echoed across the village. "We know you're here. Colonel's orders are to bring you back alive, but don't test his patience." Jake pressed himself against the remains of a collapsed lodge. Ayana held close to his chest. The baby's warmth was a small comfort against the ice in his veins. He could see the patrol now. 6 men spread out in a search pattern, their rifles ready. "Found his horse," one of the soldiers called out. "And his coat," Jake cursed silently. Ranger stood exactly where he'd left him, reins trailing in the snow. The horse was trained to ground tie, but now that training was about to get Jake killed, or worse, captured and hanged for desertion. "Spread out," Mills commanded. "He's on foot, can't have gone far." Jake knew he had minutes at most before they found him. The village offered little cover, and the open plains beyond would make him an easy target. But then he remembered Standing Bear's words about the canyon 3 days north. First, he had to survive the next 3 minutes. Moving carefully, Jake made his way toward the back of the village where a small creek ran through a grove of cottonwoods. The water was partially frozen, but it would mask his scent and muffle his footsteps. Ayana stirred in his arms, and he whispered soothing words, praying she wouldn't cry out. "Sir," another soldier's voice, younger, nervous. "Found blood over here and tracks leading toward the creek." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He was out of time. Clutching Ayana tighter, he broke into a run, splashing through the shallow water, ice cracking under his boots. Behind him, he heard Mills shouting orders, the sound of running feet. The creek bent sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the land. Jake followed it, using the cottonwoods and brush for cover. The baby bounced in his arms, but she remained silent, her dark eyes wide and trusting. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air, the bullet splintering bark from a tree inches from Jake's head. He dove behind a fallen log, his body curled protectively around Ayana. "There!" Mills' voice, closer now. "By the creek!" Jake peered over the log and saw them. 4 soldiers moving through the grove, their weapons trained on his position. 2 more flanked around to his left, trying to cut off his escape route. Professional soldiers, well trained and experienced. Under normal circumstances, Jake would have admired their tactics, but these weren't normal circumstances. "Last chance, Morrison," Mills called out. "Come out peaceful and maybe the colonel goes easy on you." Jake almost laughed. He'd seen what Hartwell considered going easy on deserters. A quick court-martial, maybe a few kind words about faithful service, then a rope and a shallow grave. Ayanna made a small sound, not quite a cry, but close. Jake rocked her gently, his mind working frantically. The soldiers were closing in, and he had nowhere to run. The creek continued north, but it would take him into open country, where he'd be visible for miles. Then he heard it, the sound of unshod hooves on stone, moving fast. Through the trees, Jake caught a glimpse of riders approaching from the east, Comanche warriors, their faces painted for war, riding hard toward the village. Mills heard them too. "Hostile riders, east flank," he shouted. "Prepare for engagement!" The soldiers immediately shifted their attention from Jake to the new threat. In the confusion, Jake saw his chance. He sprinted north along the creek, keeping low, Ayanna pressed against his chest. Behind him, rifle fire erupted as the cavalry patrol engaged the Comanche warriors. Jake didn't look back. He ran through the grove, his lungs burning in the cold air, his legs pumping despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. The baby bounced in his arms, but she seemed to understand that silence meant survival. He reached the edge of the cottonwoods and paused, breathing hard. Ahead lay open prairie, rolling hills covered in snow, that would show his tracks for miles. But he had no choice. Staying near the village meant certain death or capture. The gunfire behind him was intensifying. Through the trees, he could see muzzle flashes and the smoke of battle. Whatever Standing Bear's people were doing, they were buying him time he desperately needed. Jake struck out across the open ground, moving as fast as he could while carrying the baby. His cavalry boots weren't made for this kind of travel, and already he could feel blisters forming. But he pushed on, driven by desperation and a growing sense of responsibility for the small life in his arms. The sun climbed higher, and with it came a bitter wind that cut through his shirt like a blade. Jake wrapped the buffalo robe tighter around both himself and Ayanna, but he knew they needed shelter soon. The baby was tough, tougher than any white child her age would have been, but she was still just an infant, vulnerable to the brutal Texas winter. Behind him, the sound of gunfire faded. Jake didn't know if that was because the battle was over, or because he'd moved beyond hearing distance. Either way, he couldn't stop. Not yet. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith, providing little warmth, but at least no longer blinding him. Jake's legs felt like lead, and his arms ached from carrying Ayanna, but he kept moving. The baby had fallen asleep, exhausted by the morning's trauma, her small body warm against his chest. It was mid-afternoon when Jake saw the rider, a single figure on horseback, perhaps a mile behind him, following his trail across the snow. Jake's blood turned to ice. Had the cavalry patrol survived the Comanche attack? Was Mills tracking him even now? Jake looked around desperately. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional stunted tree or boulder. No cover, no place to hide. He was trapped in the open with nowhere to run. The rider was closing the distance, and Jake could see now that it was a single horse and rider, not a patrol. That was something, at least. But one experienced tracker could be just as dangerous as 6 soldiers. Jake kept walking, his pace steady despite his exhaustion. He wouldn't panic. He wouldn't give up. Not with Ayanna depending on him. The rider was close enough now that Jake could make out details. A big man on a paint horse, wearing buckskins and a wide-brimmed hat. Not cavalry. That much was clear. But friend or foe? Jake stopped walking and turned to face the approaching rider, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt .45. Ayanna stirred in his arms, sensing the tension. The rider reined in his horse 50 yards away, well out of pistol range but close enough to talk. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life on the frontier. "You Jake Morrison?" the man called out. "Who's asking?" Jake replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The man smiled, and Jake saw genuine warmth in his eyes. "Name's Thomas Whitehorse. I'm a friend of Standing Bear's. He sent me to find you." Jake felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Whitehorse reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Jake's throat tighten with emotion. It was a small beaded bracelet, the kind Comanche mothers made for their children. Jake had seen one just like it on Ayanna's wrist. "Standing Bear said to give you this," Whitehorse said. "Said it belonged to his daughter, said you'd understand." Jake looked down at Ayanna, then back at the man on the horse. "What happened to the soldiers?" "They won't be following you," Whitehorse said grimly. "But there'll be others. The army don't take kindly to deserters, especially ones who take Indian children." "I'm not taking her," Jake said firmly. "I'm saving her." Whitehorse nodded approvingly. "Standing Bear figured you'd say something like that. That's why he sent me. You're gonna need help getting to that canyon he told you about." For the first time since dawn, Jake allowed himself to hope. "You know the way?" "Son," Whitehorse said, dismounting and approaching slowly, "I was born in that canyon. Been hiding folks there for 20 years. Welcome to the Underground Railroad, frontier style." Thomas Whitehorse proved to be a man of few words but decisive action. Within minutes of their meeting, he had Jake mounted on his paint horse while he walked alongside, leading them off the main trail into a maze of arroyos and hidden paths that seemed to exist only in his weathered memory. "Army'll be sending out patrols by now," Whitehorse said as they made their way through a narrow canyon that twisted like a snake through the red rock. "Colonel Hartwell's got a reputation for being thorough when it comes to deserters." Jake shifted Ayanna in his arms, adjusting the buffalo robe to keep her warm. The baby had woken an hour ago and accepted a few drops of water from Whitehorse's canteen, but she needed proper food soon. Her small face was pale, and Jake could feel how light she was, too light for a child her age. "How far to this canyon?" Jake asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "We'll be there by nightfall," Whitehorse replied, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges above them. "But distance ain't our biggest problem. Word's already spreading about what happened at the village. Comanche war parties are riding, and they ain't making distinctions between good soldiers and bad ones." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Whitehorse immediately pressed himself against the rock face, motioning for Jake to do the same. They waited in tense silence as the riders passed overhead, their horses' hooves clattering on stone. "Cavalry," Whitehorse whispered once the sound faded. "4 riders, maybe 5. They're casting a wide net." Jake looked down at Ayanna, who had been remarkably quiet throughout their journey. Her dark eyes seemed to study his face with an intensity that unsettled him. There was something ancient in that gaze, as if she understood far more than any infant should. "She's not crying," Jake observed softly. Whitehorse glanced at the baby and nodded. "Comanche children learn early that silence means survival. She knows you're trying to protect her." They continued through the winding canyon as afternoon shadows lengthened. Jake found himself thinking about the morning's events, how everything had changed in a matter of hours. This time yesterday, he'd been a cavalry scout with a steady job and a clear purpose. Now he was a fugitive, responsible for the life of a child who represented everything his former comrades had tried to destroy. "You ever have children?" Whitehorse asked suddenly. Jake's throat tightened. "Had a son, Billy. He'd be about 7 now if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Apache." Whitehorse's voice was gentle, understanding. "Yeah, they hit our homestead while I was away on a scouting mission. Killed my wife Sarah and took Billy. Found his body 3 days later." Jake's voice was barely audible above the wind. "That's why I joined the cavalry. Thought I could make a difference, maybe prevent other families from going through what we did." Whitehorse was quiet for a long moment. "And now?" Jake looked down at Ayanna, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "Now I'm not sure who the real enemy is anymore." The canyon began to open up ahead of them, revealing a hidden valley surrounded by towering red cliffs. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was beautiful, a secret world tucked away from the harsh realities of the frontier. A small stream ran through the center, and Jake could see the dark mouths of caves dotting the cliff faces. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Whitehorse said with obvious pride. "Been hiding people here for 20 years. Runaway slaves, deserters, Indians fleeing the reservations, mixed-blood families with nowhere else to go." As they approached the valley floor, Jake began to see signs of habitation. Smoke rose from carefully concealed fire pits, and figures emerged from the caves. A diverse group of people who had one thing in common. They were all refugees from a world that had no place for them. A woman approached them, her face lined with worry. She was clearly of mixed heritage, with dark hair braided in the Comanche style but wearing a simple cotton dress. "Thomas, thank God you're back. We heard shooting from the south." "Cavalry patrol," Whitehorse explained. "They're looking for Jake here. He's got Standing Bear's granddaughter." The woman's eyes widened as she saw the baby in Jake's arms. "Sweet Jesus, is that little Ayanna? I heard about the raid on the village." She reached out tentatively. "May I?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred the baby to the woman's arms. Ayana stirred but didn't cry, seeming to sense the gentleness in the stranger's touch. "I'm Maria Santos," the woman said, her voice soft with emotion. "I knew her mother, Nadua, such a sweet girl." She looked up at Jake with tears in her eyes. "Standing Bear told us what you did, how you went back for her." "I couldn't leave her," Jake said simply. Maria nodded, understanding. "Come, she needs food and warmth, and you look like you could use both yourself." They made their way to one of the larger caves, where Maria had created a comfortable living space. Animal skins covered the stone floor, and a small fire provided warmth without creating too much smoke. Other women appeared, some white, some Indian, some clearly of mixed heritage, all offering help and comfort. As Maria began preparing a thin gruel that Ayana could eat, Jake found himself the center of attention. The cave's other occupants wanted to hear about the raid, about his decision to desert, about the baby's rescue. He told the story haltingly, still processing the morning's events himself. "You did the right thing," said an elderly black man named Samuel, who had apparently been a runaway slave before the war. "Sometimes a man's got to choose between what's legal and what's right." "But what happens now?" asked a young woman with the pale features of a white settler, but the clothing and ornaments of a Comanche. "The army won't stop looking for him, and if they find this place—" The cave fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. Sanctuary had survived by remaining hidden, by being a place that existed in the spaces between the official maps and military patrols. Jake's presence put everyone at risk. "Maybe I should leave," Jake said quietly. "Take Ayana and keep moving. I won't be responsible for bringing the army down on all of you." "Where would you go?" Whitehorse asked. "You're a deserter carrying an Indian child. There's no place in the territories that would be safe for you." Jake watched as Maria fed Ayana tiny spoonfuls of gruel, the baby accepting the food eagerly. For the first time since the morning, Ayana looked content, even happy. The sight stirred something deep in Jake's chest, a feeling he'd thought was dead and buried with his own son. "There might be a way," said a voice from the cave entrance. Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted against the fading daylight. As the person stepped into the firelight, Jake saw it was a young Comanche man, perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of a warrior. "This is Joseph Crow Feather," Whitehorse explained. "He's been acting as a go-between for us and the tribes." Joseph approached the fire, his movements graceful and purposeful. "I've been speaking with the tribal councils. There's talk of a gathering, a great council of all the tribes. They want to discuss the future, what comes next after the army's raids." "What does that have to do with Jake?" Maria asked. Joseph looked directly at Jake, his expression serious. "You saved Standing Bear's granddaughter. That makes you family in the eyes of the people. If you were to come to the council to speak for the child, to tell what you witnessed—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It might change things." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the canyon air. "You're talking about me testifying against my own people." "Your people?" Joseph's voice was calm but pointed. "The men who murdered women and children? The men who would hang you for showing mercy to a baby?" Jake looked down at Ayana, who had finished eating and was now looking up at him with those impossibly wise eyes. In that moment, he realized that his old life was truly over. The man who had ridden with the cavalry that morning was gone, replaced by someone he didn't fully recognize yet. "When is this council?" he asked quietly. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. 2 weeks, in the sacred canyon 50 miles north of here, but Jake, his expression grew serious again. "If you do this, there's no going back. You'll be marked as a traitor by the army, a turncoat by the settlers. The only family you'll have is the one you choose to make." Jake reached out and gently touched Ayana's small hand. Her tiny fingers closed around his calloused index finger with surprising strength. "I think I've already made my choice," he said softly. Outside the cave, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like a lament for all the lives lost and all the choices that could never be undone. But inside the cave, by the warmth of the fire, a baby slept peacefully in the arms of the man who had chosen to save her, surrounded by people who had found their own ways to survive in a world that had rejected them. For now, it was enough. 2 weeks had passed like a fever dream. Jake Morrison, though he'd begun to think of himself simply as Jake, no longer bound by military rank or family name, had spent those days learning to care for Ayana while preparing for the most important decision of his life. The baby had grown stronger under Maria's gentle care, her cheeks filling out, and her eyes bright with curiosity about the world around her. The sacred canyon lay beneath a canopy of stars, as representatives from 7 tribes gathered for the Great Council. Jake sat beside the fire, Ayana sleeping peacefully in his arms, wrapped in a new blanket that Maria had woven from buffalo wool and decorated with protective symbols. Around the fire sat chiefs, warriors, medicine men, and tribal mothers, the keepers of wisdom and tradition. Standing Bear sat across from Jake, his weathered face reflecting the firelight. In the 2 weeks since the massacre, the old warrior had aged years. The loss of his daughter weighed heavily on him, but Jake could see something else in the man's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. "My friends," began Chief Red Cloud of the Lakota, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "We gather in dark times. The bluecoats grow bolder, their attacks more brutal. Our children are stolen, our women murdered, our sacred places burned." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the fire. Jake felt the weight of hostile gazes from some of the younger warriors, men who saw only his white skin and cavalry background, but others looked at him with curiosity, waiting to hear why Standing Bear had asked this stranger to address the council. "But tonight," Red Cloud continued, "we hear from one who has seen both sides of this war. Standing Bear, tell us of your son-in-law." Standing Bear rose slowly, his back straight despite his grief. "This man," he said, gesturing to Jake, "rode with the soldiers who killed my daughter. But when the killing was done, when his brothers in arms rode away, he heard the cry of an innocent child and chose mercy over duty." The old warrior's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "He threw away his uniform, abandoned his people, risked his life to save my granddaughter. The soldiers hunt him now as they hunt us. He has chosen to share our exile, our danger. I call him son, and I ask you to hear his words." Jake stood carefully, adjusting Ayana in his arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her small form a tangible reminder of why he was here. He looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some suspicious, all bearing the weight of generations of conflict and pain. "I don't expect forgiveness," Jake began, his voice rough with emotion. "I've worn the blue coat, followed orders that I knew were wrong. I told myself I was serving justice, protecting innocent people, but I was protecting the wrong people." A young Cheyenne warrior started to rise, anger flashing in his eyes, but Chief Red Cloud raised a hand for silence. "I lost my wife and son to an Apache raid 5 years ago," Jake continued. "I thought that gave me the right to hate, the right to seek revenge against all Indians. But holding this child, seeing her trust—" He paused, looking down at Ayana's peaceful face. "I realized that grief doesn't justify becoming the very thing you claim to fight against." He lifted his head, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. "What I witnessed at the Comanche village wasn't war. It was slaughter. Old men, women, children who never raised a weapon against anyone. The soldiers I rode with have forgotten the difference between warriors and innocents." "Pretty words," said the young Cheyenne warrior, his voice sharp with skepticism. "But you are still one of them. What proof do we have that this isn't some elaborate deception?" Standing Bear spoke before Jake could respond. "The proof sleeps in his arms. My granddaughter lives because this man chose her life over his own safety. The proof is that he stands here as a hunted man, branded a traitor by his own people." Joseph Crow Feather, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "I've spent time with him these past weeks. I've watched him tend to the child, seen how she responds to him. There's no deception in the way she reaches for him, the way she calms at the sound of his voice." As if summoned by their words, Ayana opened her eyes and looked up at Jake. She made a small sound, not quite a word, but something approaching communication. Jake smiled down at her, and she grasped at his finger with tiny hands. "She knows you," observed an elderly Apache woman whose face was marked with ritual scars. "The spirits have made their choice clear." Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine not just his own fate, but Ayana's as well. "I can't undo what I've done, can't bring back the lives that were lost, but I can offer you something the army doesn't expect. Information about their plans, their movements, their weaknesses." The council erupted in excited murmurs. This was more than they had dared hope for, not just testimony about past atrocities, but intelligence that could save lives in the future. "In return," Jake continued, raising his voice above the whispers, "I ask for nothing but the chance to raise this child as she should be raised, knowing both worlds, understanding both peoples, but never forgetting where she comes from." Chief Red Cloud studied Jake with ancient, knowing eyes. "You speak of raising her to know both worlds. But can you teach her the old ways when you yourself are just learning them? No, Jake admitted. I can't. That's why I'm asking for help, for teachers, for the wisdom of the elders. I don't want to replace her people. I want to become part of them. Standing Bear's eyes glistened with unshed tears. In our tradition, he said slowly, when a warrior dies in battle, another may take his place in the family, take on his responsibilities, his obligations. My daughter's husband died 3 moons ago hunting buffalo. The child has no father. The implication hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he understood what Standing Bear was offering, not just acceptance but adoption, a true place in the tribe. I would be honored, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The old chief nodded solemnly. Then let it be so. But know this, the path you choose is harder than the one you left behind. Our people face dark days ahead. The reservations grow smaller, the buffalo disappear, the old ways are forgotten. Can you help a child navigate between 2 worlds when both are changing so quickly? Jake looked down at Ayana, who was watching him with those impossibly wise eyes. In her face, he saw something he hadn't expected, the future. Not the grim future of endless conflict and cultural destruction that seemed inevitable, but something else, a bridge between worlds, a hope for understanding, a chance for healing. I can try, he said simply. We can try together. The council deliberated for another hour, voices rising and falling in passionate debate. Some argued that trusting any white man was folly, that Jake's conversion might be temporary or false. Others pointed to the child in his arms, to Standing Bear's endorsement, to the valuable intelligence he offered. In the end, it was Chief Red Cloud who spoke the final words. The spirits work in mysterious ways, he said, his voice carrying across the canyon. They took a daughter from Standing Bear, but they may have given him a son. They took a soldier from the army, but they may have given us an ally. We accept your offer, Jake Morrison. You will speak for us to the white world when the time comes, and we will teach you and the child the ways of the people. As the council dispersed, Jake found himself alone with Standing Bear and Ayana beside the dying fire. The old warrior reached out and gently touched his granddaughter's cheek. She looks like her mother at that age, he said softly. Nadua was always reaching for things beyond her grasp, always curious about the world beyond the village. He looked up at Jake with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. Perhaps that curiosity will serve Ayana well in the world you and she must navigate together. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. I'll do everything I can to keep her safe, to help her understand both sides of her heritage. Standing Bear smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. I know you will, my son. The spirits brought you to us for a reason. Perhaps it was to save one small life, or perhaps it was to help heal a much larger wound. 3 months later, as spring painted the prairie with wildflowers, Jake Morrison sat outside a small cabin he'd built in a hidden valley 50 miles from any settlement. Ayana crawled in the grass beside him, babbling in a mixture of English and Comanche words that Maria and Standing Bear had been teaching her. In the distance, a rider approached, Thomas Whitehorse, bringing news from the outside world. Jake knew the news wouldn't be good. It never was these days. The conflicts were escalating, the government's policies growing harsher, the divide between the races widening. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. A baby laughed as she discovered a butterfly in the grass. A man who had lost everything found himself rebuilding a life he'd never imagined. And somewhere in the dance between past and future, between 2 worlds struggling to understand each other, hope took root like a wildflower after rain. Jake picked up Ayana and held her high above his head, laughing as she squealed with delight. She was his daughter now in every way that mattered, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A white man, a Comanche child, and the bridge of love that connected them to both worlds. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years it was also full of possibility.